Welcome to this latest Zillow talk, which is a really exciting one for a couple of reasons. One, because of our guests that I'll introduce here in a moment, but also because we're celebrating our 6th birthday of our launch. So 6 years ago, about a day and a half ago, we turned on the switch for Zillow, and we're all of a sudden bombarded with our first million visitors in the first 3 days we were live. So it was a very big day for Zillow, and one that we continue to celebrate now in year 6, and one that's actually really appropriate for our guests today because it was on our 1-year birthday that Zillow was on the cover of Fortune magazine in February 2007. So great to have Adam here today. As you all saw from Adam Lashinsky's bio, he's a senior editor-at-large of Fortune magazine. He's been covering tech companies like Zillow and like many of the big names you all know since 2001 at Fortune.
Yep, that's right.
And for a number of years before that at a couple other publications, including the San Jose Mercury News. So his career has been spent following some of the biggest brands in the world, and certainly the brands that all of us here at Zillow are familiar with and follow very closely. Adam's getting a lot of attention right now for a book he recently wrote about Apple and about inside Apple and the culture of Apple, and it's really, really a fascinating study of how things work there and how it's different from so many other Silicon Valley companies. So we have lots of questions to ask him about that. And lots of fun stories for him to tell us. And I'll open it up at the end for questions. Also, we have a table full of books here. They're for everyone. If you'd like to have it signed, you can line up with Adam afterwards. And if for some reason you don't get one today, we'll make sure that everyone who wants one gets one. Okay, so Adam, first of all, welcome. Welcome to Zillow.
Thank you very much. Thank you for buying all those books.
We're here for you, man.
It is very exciting to be here. What a great group. A lot of energy in the room.
Good, yeah, and welcome to our new office. I have so much to ask you, but obviously I want to start with the book because this is the thing that I know a lot of people are reading it right now, have read about it, and there's so much inside of it. So, just start from the beginning with this book. Where did it come from? Why did you decide to do it, and how did you do it? How did you find out all this information?
Okay, so I'll take a half a step back. I'm not one of these people who covered Apple forever. I actually wrote my first significant piece on Apple in 2008, which was a cover story about the then Chief Operating Officer, Tim Cook, and the headline was "The Genius Behind Steve," and then something like "Meet the Operations Whiz Who Could Be the Next CEO of Apple." And this was an assignment from an editor in New York who said, "Who the hell is this guy? Let's find out who he is. We know nothing about him." That became part of the storyline, the fact that we knew nothing about him. Nobody knew anything about Tim Cook. And as an aside, there's two kinds of great business stories, I think. There's the kind of story that Jeff O'Brien did with Zillow, where I assume he called up and said, "I'd like to write about you." And you said, "Great, come on up and we'll tell you all about us." And it worked out, really well for us, really well for you. And then there's the kind where the journalist calls up and says, "I'd like to do a profile of Tim Cook," and they say, "That's great, good luck to you." And I found out that I really like doing those kind of stories. It was a very liberating experience for me, and I've done a bunch since then. So jumping ahead to the end of your question, the way I do it is by talking to as many people as I can. It's no more complicated than good old-fashioned investigative shoe leather journalism. I find somebody who used to work at Apple, and my perspective is that anyone who walked in the door with an employee badge is of interest to me, because I'm not trying to do some top-down strategic piece. I'm trying to paint a portrait of what this company is like. And so if you worked in customer support for 2 years in the 2004 to 2006, your experiences are of interest to me. And I ask you when I'm done talking to you, who else should I talk to? Who is your boss? Who else would have an interesting perspective? In December of 2010, my boss again asked me to do a piece that came out of comments actually that Steve Jobs had made at meetings in New York with the top Time Inc. editors, and he sort of let drop at one point. It was an iPhone. I think it was an iPhone meeting. Walter Isaacson actually references this meeting in his biography of Steve Jobs. He said, we don't have any committees at Apple. We don't like the idea of committees, and we try to capture the vibe of a startup. And Andy Serwer, my boss, said, "Oh, that's interesting. We'd love to do a story on that." And Steve, I think he said, "Yeah, maybe, we'll see." And we waited and waited, and then finally Andy said to me, "Go ahead and do that story. Find out how Apple works." And I'll shut up in a moment. But what I found was that this was a different question than the rest of the press was asking. The rest of the press was doing what Apple wanted the press to do, which is to write about Apple products. And we wanted to know, what kind of company is this? And so I did that article in May of 2011, and the article grew into the book.
So let's talk a little bit about what you found out, because I know from a marketing perspective, to me, what's so fascinating about Apple is the incredibly tight grip they've had on their brand and what people know about the inside for many, many years. And I think it's pretty well known that that's very, very orchestrated from the top down to whether they give access to, or whether they gave access to Tim Cook for many years. So talk a little bit about that, when you started to kind of pull the blanket back, what you saw underneath there and what you started learning about the culture of Apple.
So there were a bunch of truisms, or there were things I think that people already knew intuitively. If people chose to care, they knew this, but I didn't know to what extent of the way Apple behaves. So we know that they're very good at marketing. We know they're very clever about their message. But what I learned were the specifics of how they deliver the message, how careful they are, how controlling they are. So they're controlling down to the precise words that they use when they communicate with the outside world about the product. They're controlling about who can do that. So, for example, I write in the book that when they launched the iPhone in 2007, they designated 5 executives who were authorized to speak publicly about the iPhone. 5. And that didn't include 2 of the most senior executives, senior vice presidents who had worked on the product. They weren't on the list, so they didn't communicate. And so, for example, I write in the book, everyone remembers 1,000 songs in your pocket. 1,000 songs in your pocket is a brilliant line. And what I explain in the book, that was for the iPod, obviously, but for the iPhone, what I explain, I quote one of the 5 people who was authorized to speak publicly, said, what you want to do is, he said, intellectually, when you go out and you give 50 interviews on something, you're going to want to deviate from the script, because as a human being, you get tired of hearing the same
Spencer.
thing 50 times. But the listener's hearing it for the first time, number one. And number two, you want that listener not to repeat something that you thought was interesting that morning, but the line that we worked on carefully, because they're going to repeat it to their friends, and pretty soon the consumer is going to start parroting back the line that we crafted very carefully in the meeting.
And when you say they're very controlling, the they,
Apple.
It sounds like is a very small group, though, at the top. I mean, is it tops down on this stuff?
Everything at Apple is top down. So, and this is a sort of a, I don't want to say controversial topic, but it's a tense topic because of Steve Jobs' death. So he controlled everything at the company. Now, he turned things over, especially to Tim Cook over the last few years. He turned whole swaths of the company over. But there were certain things that he held tight control of, and marketing was one. So yeah, he would, and I describe in the book him having this detailed exchange with a mid-level person whose job was to write an email that would go out simultaneously with a product launch at a keynote. And the exchange took place in the days leading up to the keynote. And I don't remember the precise number, but there were multiple back and forths between this person and Jobs over the grammar in the email, including colons, semicolons, and commas. Yeah, and I don't remember if I put this in the book.
We're laughing because we have a grammar corrector here.
I tell you, we care about what we care about, right? And the funny thing about this The funny thing about this anecdote, I don't remember if I put it in the book, is that I'm pretty certain, and this person who I interviewed was pretty certain, that Jobs was wrong. Like, he was wrong grammatically about this comma issue, but it didn't matter. So this is a metaphor, but I think a very relevant metaphor. This semicolon example or comma example is very germane, and so it's top down. He had his fingers in everything. But that's how the culture works. And I describe in the book, and to reverse the process, an Apple employee's life is comprised of preparing one's boss, to prepare one's boss, to prepare one's boss to present to Steve Jobs. Or in lieu of Steve Jobs, to the executive team or whoever's handling things now. It's a presentation culture leading up to a meeting. It's a meeting culture. And by the way, this is jumping around or ahead, but it's a face-to-face culture. It's a headquarters culture. It is not a teleconference, or video conference. It's not even a particularly big off-site culture, except for the top 100. You go to meetings in Cupertino and you talk to each other. By the way, you argue with each other viciously, but that's how things get done at Apple.
So we laughed at the anecdote about grammar because Spencer's a grammar hound. But I think one thing we can say about Zillow, and one thing you can say about a lot of companies, is the corporate culture is often in sync with the brand. So when I think about the Zillow brand and I think about it being open and open to people and transparent, that's very much the culture that I think Spencer tries to engender internally and how he is as a person. Apple, we're talking about really something really different here. I mean, it's a whimsical, fun brand, but under the covers, it sounds like not like that at all as far as how it is to work there.
This was one of my great realizations. Something that I think people who cover Apple or people who know Apple knew, and I should have known it, but then it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks. Users, consumers love Apple. Apple has literally has a shiny, happy veneer to it. It makes you feel good. And there's nothing shiny or happy about inside the doors of Apple, and it's true. And it's hard to, you don't want to overgeneralize. I don't want to say that there's no joy, because I think there is some, particularly in the engineering core of people who are Mac engineers and have dreamt of being Mac engineers since they were wee lads and lasses. But by and large, it's a very confrontational, work-oriented place. And so, I describe in the book, there was a period where I was on a kick of trying to find out what the vibe was like, and I would say to ex-Apple people, was it fun to work at Apple? And people would dodge the question. They'd say, people at Apple have a sense of mission about Apple. And I'd say, yeah, but what is it? Was it fun? And they'd say, it's a very purposeful place. You come into work, you take great pride in what Apple accomplishes. And I was like, okay, I get it. I'll stop asking the question.